All right, let's go ahead and get started this morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's program to discuss how Maine towns and cities statewide are taking advantage of solar energy to reduce their energy costs and how your town could take advantage as well. I hope that you and your families are safe and healthy during this COVID-19 pandemic we are still going through. We would have loved to have been with you in person today for this presentation. But we appreciate you adapting and joining us here online instead. It means we don't have to travel, which is a nice bonus. My name is Todd Martin. I'm the Grassroots Outreach Coordinator at the Natural Resources Council of Maine, NRCM. We are a nonprofit membership organization protecting, restoring, and conserving Maine's environment now and for future generations. For more than 60 years, NRCM has protected the way of life that makes Maine so special. We harness the power of the law, science, and the support of more than 25,000 members and supporters statewide and beyond. We have a staff of about 30, and our office is located in Augusta, just steps from the State House. But like most people these days, we're all working remotely, so I'm coming to you from Winslow today. Before we get started with today's program and our panelists, just a couple of notes about the Zoom platform that we're using here this morning. I'm sure we're all experts with Zoom this far into the pandemic, but just a couple of pointers. So this program is being recorded, and you'll get an email from me tomorrow with a link to watch the recording on YouTube. And we hope that you'll share that recording with other folks in your town. Your video and your audio is disabled this morning by design. You'll only be able to hear and see our panelists today. But if you have a question throughout the program, please type that question in the Q&A box, which you can see on the lower ribbon of your Zoom screen. Just type your question in there and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer after our panel discussion. So to get us started, I want to turn it over to Shelley Norton from the Androscoggin Valley Council of Governments about the important work that they do to help towns in Androscoggin, Oxford, and Franklin counties thrive. So Shelley, take it away.
Good morning and welcome this morning. Thank you, Todd. I'm Shelley Norton. I'm a land use planner for Androscoggin Valley Council of Governments. We provide a number of services to our region of Androscoggin, Franklin, and most of Oxford County communities. One of the services that I particularly provide as land use planner is technical assistance in planning, especially related to solar, which we're talking about today, includes the assistance with researching and writing solar review ordinances, as well as development review assistance for applications for solar projects in front of planning boards in towns. So before we get started, I wanted to thank Natural Resources Council of Maine and Maine Audubon for coordinating this presentation today, and thank our presenters for sharing their time and expertise with us. Our first speaker this morning is Todd from NRCM.
Great, thanks, Shelley. Really appreciate it. Nick, if you can go back to the previous slide for a second. So this is our agenda for this morning. You can check the first thing off the box there. So first, you'll hear a quick background on how we got here. There's been some important solar energy policy passed here in Maine in recent years. So I'll give a brief overview of solar policy, where we've been and where we're going. Then you'll hear from Andrew Kahrl from Revision Energy about Municipal Solar 101, sort of the basics. Then you'll hear from Nick Lund from Maine Audubon about solar siting best practices, what you should look for in a good solar energy development site. Then you hear from Chris Byers from Boyle Associates about responsible solar development and sort of the permitting side of things. And then you'll hear from Joe Roach and Tracy Lavoie from the town of Rangeley about a municipal solar project that Rangeley has invested in. And then we'll get to questions from the audience. Next slide. So Maine solar policy, where we've been and where we're going. Next slide. So just quickly, a little bit more about the Natural Resources Council of Maine. So our organization, again, is a nonprofit 501c3. We are nonpartisan. We don't work on elections. What we do is we work to pass strong environmental policy, including solar energy policy at the State House. Our policy advocates help write legislation, we testify at public hearings, lobby legislators, and we help build coalitions. About 6 years ago, NRCM started a Maine Solar Coalition to bring together developers, nonprofits, planners, to help get Maine solar policy in a better place. And we've been working together for about 6 years, and it's one of the real reasons why we are really seeing the benefits of solar here in Maine today. Next slide, please. So I want to actually start with a poll question as well. So I'm going to launch a poll just to get a temperature of the room. You know, where is your town in the solar process? Are you sort of in the exploratory kind of learning about solar? You've identified a site. Are you working with a solar developer? Are you going through the permitting process? Has construction started? Or do you have an operational project? Just to kind of get a gauge of the audience here today. So I'll leave this poll open for just a few more seconds here. So you can see the results here. Most of you are in the exploratory phase, just gathering information. That's good, you're in the right place. A few are working with a developer, a couple are going through permitting, and a few are going through construction. So nice diversity in the audience today. So thanks for that. So solar in Maine, where we've been. This is a chart from 2016 that we put together, so it's a little bit outdated. But just to say that Maine was way far behind other New England and mid-Atlantic states for the amount of solar that we had installed. Back in 2016, Vermont and New Jersey had about 20 times more solar per capita than Maine. So we were really missing out on the economic benefits and the job creation opportunities that other states to our south were enjoying. Next slide. And just to put a finer point on Maine missing out on these jobs, you know, solar has been a great job creator here in Maine. Andrew will speak a little bit about the tremendous growth that Revision has seen over the last decade and a half, going from just a couple folks to over 200 employees in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, I believe. But you know, Maine was really missing out on solar jobs. And I personally have friends that I graduated college from back in 2010 who had to move out of Maine to work in the solar industry. They wanted to stay here in Maine, they wanted to work in their home state, but there just wasn't opportunity, so they had to leave the state. Next slide. So for many, many years, Maine solar policy was really in the dark ages. The LePage administration was rolling back critical pieces of Maine's solar energy policy. And we were going backwards instead of forward to realize the economic and job creation potential. And it wasn't just NRCM and Maine Audubon and Revision and some of these other solar development companies who got us to where we are today. It was Maine people from all around the state coming to Augusta, testifying, talking to their lawmakers that helped us get strong solar policy. For more than 8 years, they came back to the State House year after year to help push for strong solar policy. So really Maine people really helped get us to where we are today. Next slide, please. So where we're going. So after backwards rules and years of inaction under the previous administration, in 2019, the Maine Legislature and Governor Mills acted to accelerate solar jobs and increase the amount of solar for Maine residents, for businesses, and for municipalities. Several pieces of legislation were enacted in 2019 by both Republicans and Democrats. Solar policy had strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, because Mainers of all political stripes from all parts of the state spoke up in favor for many, many years. Next slide. One of the first things that the legislature did in 2019 was pass a bill, LD 91, to restore solar net metering for residential customers. So we probably know that net metering measures the amount of energy folks with solar panels are producing and that they put onto the grid for others to use, and then gives them a credit on their monthly electricity bills that they can use to purchase power back from the grid. Net metering has made it possible for thousands of Maine homes to invest in businesses to invest in solar to produce their own energy. Net metering is sort of the standard and it's used all around the country. So that was one of the first things that the legislature did in 2019. The LePage administration had rolled back net metering and actually started charging people for producing their own solar energy. So the legislature acted quickly to restore net metering. The legislature in 2019 also passed LD 1494 to update Maine's renewable portfolio standard. Today, Maine gets about 45% of its energy from renewable sources, including wind and solar. But Maine is now committed to getting 80% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So in the next decade, the state is committed to getting to 80% renewable energy, which is fantastic. It's going to take a tremendous growth of solar, which is what we're seeing here today. So getting to 80% in the next 10 years is going to take a lot of work, but we're already starting to see tremendous growth in solar all around the state, which is why we're here today. Next slide. The legislature in 2019 also passed LD 1711, and this was sort of the omnibus solar bill. This bill had many components that really helped ramp up the solar industry here in Maine. So the Maine Public Utilities Commission, as a result of this bill, will initiate a competitive bidding process for developers to work with communities and landowners to build 250 megawatts of community solar. And we're already starting to see that growth here in Maine. There's going to be incentives to build these projects on previously impacted lands like landfills or rooftops of existing buildings. And later in the program, you'll hear from Nick Lund from Maine Audubon about solar siting best practices. Next slide, please. Furthermore, LD 1711 included a measure to design about 125 megawatts of commercial solar. This is going to help Maine businesses all around the state lower and stabilize their energy costs for years to come. Next slide. And why you're all here today is one of the other components that LD 1711 did was really make solar more accessible to towns all around the state. Dozens of towns all around the state are already investing in municipal solar to reduce their energy cost and gain predictable and stable energy costs for years to come. The bill removed barriers so that more towns could go solar, whether through a single municipal electrical account or multiple electrical accounts. The bill allows towns and cities to subscribe to projects that are as large as 5 megawatts in their same utility territory and receive credits on their electricity bills, typically at no upfront cost through a power purchase agreement, which you'll learn more about here today. So this allows towns to lock in lower and predictable electricity rates for terms of up to 20 to 30 years. It's a great opportunity for towns to reduce their energy costs. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Kahrl now from Revision Energy, which is Maine's largest solar development company, to tell us more about municipal solar. And we're going to have to switch screens here. So Andrew, just give us 1 second here. All right. Thanks for bearing with us.
Thanks very much for the nice introduction, Todd, and thanks very much to NRCM and Maine Audubon for organizing this event. It was really nice to see a couple of Revision Energy solar projects in Todd's slides, and nice to see some of our people, showing up at those bill signings, and and even back into the LePage administration showing up at the legislature to lobby for positive solar change. It's a nice walk down memory lane to just illustrates to me how integral Revision Energy has been to bringing these changes about in the state and expanding this opportunity for municipalities and water and sewer districts in particular. We can go right to the next slide. Revision Energy was founded in 2003 in Liberty, Maine, and in that time, from two guys in a pickup truck, we now have 280 employee owners. We're a 100% employee-owned company, and we're proudly a certified B Corp. We've now installed over 10,000 renewable energy systems in northern New England, and the vast majority of those have been in Maine. And we now have a total of 5 branches in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. But our headquarters is still in Maine. We were founded in Maine, and very, very proud of that fact. Next slide, please. So just a brief update on where we see the industry right now and what's going on in the state. Broadly speaking, you can separate the solar industry in Maine into 3 categories. There's residential installers, which also probably you could include small commercial projects on your mom and pop stores and restaurants and that sort of thing. There's the commercial and institutional projects, which we're going to be talking about mostly today. And then there are the utility scale projects, which probably the most famous one of those in Maine is in Pittsfield that Kimbrough built, which generates electricity directly to the transmission grid and is sold at wholesale rates down to southern New England. That does not take advantage of net energy billing credits. What we're really focused on today are distributed generation projects that tie into local 3-phase utility infrastructure, not the high tension lines, and serve only to bring bill credits to customers in the state of Maine. And so we'll dig into that a little bit more. But what it means is that on these commercial and institutional scale projects, there are 3 legs to the solar stool. There's the financing, there's the land, and then there's the electrical load. So you need to have electrical load, you need to have bills to offset in order to make these projects work. And then obviously you need land with available grid capacity, and you need to have somebody to come in with money. And what we see in the industry is that there are multiple companies that provide various parts of the stool. Some provide all, some provide only one leg of the stool. There are some companies that come in just as developers who say, we're going to find a piece of land, file interconnection paperwork with the utility company, and start permitting on that parcel of land. And then we'll subcontract out a broker to go out and find municipalities, water districts, or others who want to subscribe to these projects. We'll find investors to put the money forward. And then once the land is developed and we've got loads signed up, we'll hire EPC contractors. And then after that, the investor will often hire an O&M contractor to take care of that equipment after it's been built, and asset management to do billing and utility communications. A company like Revision Energy is a developer of solar parcels, and we're also an EPC contractor. We build the project, procure the equipment, do the engineering, and build it. And we also do operation and maintenance of that equipment after it's built. And one thing I want to highlight on this slide too is that Maine has a finite amount of grid capacity to take these solar projects. So there's a physical limit on how much electricity the grid can take back from solar energy. And all of these projects are sort of very quickly taking up the amount of grid capacity that we have in the state on each and every substation that provides distributed energy. And so that is going to provide a natural cap on how much solar can actually be built here. Next slide, please. So I'll preface this by saying any municipality or water and sewer district or any other customer who comes to us with cash on hand who wants to invest in solar equipment, and virtually the same for any solar developer. Solar developers love to do cash projects. So we'll set that aside and say that the vast majority of tax exempt organizations, including municipalities and water and sewer districts, tend to move forward with power purchase agreements or net energy billing credit purchase and sale agreements, which is a zero investment way of going solar, where you essentially subscribe to a piece of solar infrastructure and you buy net energy billing credits that reduce your power bill at a discount. So if you buy a credit that reduces your power bill by $10, you buy it for less than $10 and thereby get some savings. It's got a separate investor, and essentially the developer or the broker comes to you and gives you an offer. So many of you will already have received offers or can solicit offers to buy discounted power from these projects. They can be constructed on land or rooftops that you have at your facilities. I know that towns and water districts in particular tend to have some extra land that doesn't have great alternative development opportunities. And so those sites can be explored as solar development opportunities, and you can have one of these power purchase agreements with no upfront investment from you constructed on that parcel or on that rooftop. And then, you can have a little bit more site control, and even in some cases, a potential to own that equipment and its depreciated value later on into the future. And then the other thing that you can do is to choose to subscribe to a project that may be already under development somewhere else in the CMP utility territory. Doesn't have to be in the next town, doesn't have to be in your town. Any project in CMP can provide net billing credits to your municipality. And then I'll just highlight the fact that investor financing runs the gamut. Revision strives to find mission-driven investors, typically with a connection to Maine, to own and operate that equipment. We don't want to put you sort of in bed with an investor who is not going to treat you right for the 20-year period of time you'll be doing business with them. Next slide, please. On-site opportunities do exist. I want to re-highlight the fact that grid capacity is limited in the state of Maine. If you feel like you have an on-site opportunity, it's critical that you get moving on seeking out development help in the next 6 months, because all it takes is new projects to get into the queue in front of you, sort of soak up that grid capacity. They get in line even before the project is built, and grid capacity can be lost very quickly, so that your project is unbuildable. Interconnection is a process with the utility company that can be costly and time consuming. And so limiting risks on that really requires moving forward quickly. Development takes 12 to 24 months, and then generally construction takes about 6 months after that. What we're looking for in a parcel of land is access to 3-phase power. Then immediately we'll start looking at substation capacity and how to de-risk that. And then permitting, obviously leading with wetlands and alternative development potential on that land are important considerations. Rooftops, structural review is critical. And then how are you going to do maintenance on that roof over the 40-year lifespan of this equipment? Is there other HVAC or other equipment on that roof that needs to be accessed? What is the lifespan of that roof, and is it worth investing in solar that's going to cover it? And partnering with a solar company that can identify red flags throughout the whole development and construction process early on in the process is critical, because if you end up working with a company that sort of signs you up for a project where there are red flags, you can get 6, 12, or 24 months down the road before those issues are surfaced. That can really happen to anybody, but local in-state development experience is a must for whoever you partner with to develop on-site projects. Next slide, please. There are dozens of off-site solar projects under development in the state of Maine today, in CMP territory. And so these offers will be coming across your desk to participate in these projects. Typically, you'll be participating as one municipality or one utility district that joins such a project with a whole group of people, or I should say a whole group of other municipalities. There is a limited supply of this energy. And so again, if you're interested in subscribing to one of these projects, you should be thinking, how do we move forward on soliciting bids in the next couple of months? One of the nice things about these projects is that they're fairly cut and dry. You can get to a contract signing quickly. If the site that you were originally signed up for doesn't work, most developers will be able to move you to the next site in their queue, so that essentially you sign that contract. And then 24 or 36 months down the road, you start getting your electricity bill credits. Again, choosing a trusted partner to work with on offsite solar opportunities is absolutely critical on the front end, because if you're working with a broker who is not a developer and it's not a construction company, they don't necessarily know what kind of promises they can follow through on. They're sort of working with a company that you are not working directly with to get those contracts signed. If projects turn out to be unbuildable down the road, or certain rates that you've been promised are not deliverable, then you can expect contract changes or simply failure of the contract down the road. So choosing trusted partners in both cases is an absolutely critical element of securing solar net energy billing credits for your town. Next slide, please. So that's all I've got. Obviously happy to talk offline with anybody who has additional questions. I think the only thing I'll add is having a close understanding of your own procurement requirements within your municipality or your water or sewer district is really the first and most important step. Do you need to take an RFP approach? Can you request qualifications instead? Or do you just want to go out and solicit bids? And that will be a good first step to moving forward with your solar goals. Thank you.
Hey folks, thank you Andrew, and thank you Todd and Shelley and AVCOG and everyone joining. I'm Nick Lund. I work at Maine Audubon. We are a conservation organization working to protect Maine wildlife and wildlife habitat. We've been at it since 1843, if you can believe it. And we do that through education, conservation, and advocacy. I'm going to pick up on some of the points that Andrew made, especially about the on-site solar, and talk about siting, best practices for siting some of these projects. Maine Audubon has been a major supporter of renewable energy for decades. When our Falmouth headquarters was built in the 1970s, it was the cutting edge of green design. And here you see some of the solar panels that we have up in what we call our North Meadow. We're about 75% powered by solar on site right now. And we're still major supporters of solar energy for individuals and for local governments. But we understand that we need to balance our desire for additional solar power with our mission to protect wildlife and wildlife habitat. Like any development or construction, wildlife and habitat might be impacted. So minimizing the natural resource impacts of solar will help maximize the benefits to users and to the landscape. And what that means is some consideration to siting. So Todd, if you could do the next slide, please. So when towns or individuals are considering developing their own solar installations, they should put effort into finding locations that minimize the environmental impacts. This report here we released this past November, and it outlines how the state, actually November 19, I believe, outlines how the state can take advantage of renewable energy while still protecting habitat for wildlife. I'm going to put a link in the chat here. We released this report onto the website of the Maine Municipal Association. We also sent it around, so some of you may have seen this in a hard copy at some point. But there's a link there to some additional downloads. Working with many of the groups on this call and many others, we developed a best practices document outlining how to avoid and minimize impacts to natural resources and agricultural resources. We also developed a model ordinance that towns can use to develop smart policies for the siting of their solar developments. All of that is available at the link that I just shared. But I'm going to run through some of the highlights, some of our top level recommendations from the report in regards to siting, and they're sort of ranked. So we'll start here. So the best thing you can do, the first thing you could look to is preferentially use disturbed, developed, or degraded habitat for your arrays, right? When you're looking around on some of the on-site stuff that Andrew mentioned, this could be town property that includes landfills, brownfields, roadway medians, edges, parking lots, rooftops, of course. Oh yeah, sorry, thanks Todd. idle or other sort of underutilized industrial commercial sites, sand and gravel pits. Using disturbed land is a use for that land where you may not have one already. And it also minimizes forest clearing, minimizes soil disturbance, and sort of takes advantage of some of these unused spaces. Rooftops, of course, are the least impactful on the landscape. And as some folks might say, they're actually the easiest to permit overall, quickest to permit. Some examples here from around the state of Maine. The image that you see right now is a 4-acre project in Portland, a place I know as Dragon Fields. This is built by Revision Energy and came online in 2018. This is a capped landfill, right? Maine has about 1,800 acres of capped landfills, enough for about 250 projects of this size, which is 1.2 megawatts. Next slide, please. This is another site developed by Revision in Durham, New Hampshire. This is a 650 kilowatt project on a gravel pit. And next slide, please. In the town of St. George, Maine, this is a rooftop installation on their transfer station. This is 67 kilowatts, and this provides about 90% of the energy needed by the town here. Finally, the Kennebec Sanitary Treatment District, KSTD, treats the wastewater for residents of the city of Waterville and Winslow and Fairfield and Benton. This here is a project at their treatment center site. It's about a megawatt, 2,800 solar panels. It offsets 85% of the electricity used per year by the facility, and offsets about over 1 million tons of CO2 per year. So those are just some examples of some really well-cited projects using either rooftops or disturbed lands. Next slide, please. Number 2, as you're looking to site your projects, please avoid or minimize impacts to sensitive wildlife habitats and high-level natural resources. What we're talking about here are places like significant wildlife habitats as identified under Maine's Natural Resources Protection Act, or other areas identified as sensitive. We're talking about endangered species habitats, rare plants, cold water fish, wetlands, eelgrass beds, areas that are focus areas of statewide ecological significance, and if possible, forested lands, lands that had not previously been cleared for agriculture or connected landscapes. Next slide, please. So there are a couple ways that towns can identify the natural resources in their area and find some potentially good sources, good areas for siting projects. One of the sites is on Maine Audubon's website. It's called our Solar Siting Viewer. You can find that at maineaudubon.org, AUDUBON. It shows you GPS layers, different GPS layers of natural and man-made features to help you identify areas of low impact or avoid areas of high impact. Another similar project is this screenshot here. This is the called Beginning with Habitat project. This is from the state. This is a section of Fairfield. It's a little hard to tell here on this screenshot, but there are different colors showing different natural resources values. So these are great places to start as you're in the exploratory phase, which it looks like many of you are, figuring out what some good places or some places to avoid might be. Next slide, please, Todd. Avoid, if possible, intact forests. Forests are important for a million reasons. They're used by habitat, they're needed for wildlife movement, they provide ecosystem services, right? They are carbon sinks and are beneficial in many other ways. And so keeping intact the forest landscapes we have is really critical. So we really recommend avoiding, to the best of your ability, forested landscapes to help maximize the benefits of the solar installation that's put elsewhere. This is a real problem. Between 2012 and 2017, about 1/4 of all land development in Massachusetts was for ground-mounted solar. About 6,000 acres of what used to be forest or farmland was converted in Massachusetts, which is good because it's a lot of solar going in the ground, but you're also losing in some cases some pretty pristine wildlife or beneficial forests. So avoid, if you can, forests. Next slide, please. Locate, if possible, near existing development. So this is good for a number of reasons. You're connected to transmission potentially, or other sort of more degraded habitats. Beginning with habitat maps help here, although wildlife movement corridors are not mapped very well. So this may be a little obvious, but if you can locate it near the built environment or co-located, of course, with transmission lines or roads, that's really beneficial. And next and final slide. Once you have built your array, you can think about the vegetation management on site. Vegetation needs to be maintained at solar sites, but if you put some effort into restoring with native vegetation, you actually give a big boost to native wildlife, including pollinators like bees and birds. The meadows around these facilities can become pollinator gardens, increasing wildlife diversity. Maine Audubon is working with the Wild Seed Project to put some resources online about how to best manage vegetation around solar arrays. So we'll be in touch with that as we make some additional progress. That's all for me. I'm looking forward to answering any questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. This is actually a pretty good segue from my presentation. My name is Chris Byers. I work for Boyle Associates, and we are an environmental consulting firm that certainly has core competency in doing wetland delineations, wildlife surveys, soil surveys, and a lot of due diligence that goes into developing a solar project. But we also act as the hub of the wheel for our clients in the permitting efforts. So not only do we work with a lot of municipalities, which is why we are on this webinar, but we also work with the Army Corps of Engineers. I work with the DEP and any other agency that might have jurisdiction over a project that's being developed. I think it's interesting. Since my last presentation with this group, my own town in North Yarmouth has formed a solar research committee, and it's kind of an interesting step that they're taking to maybe get some better resources in place on their website, or holding an educational event for citizens and understanding how can North Yarmouth benefit to this. So I think that's kind of an interesting step. I joined the committee. Obviously, I can't resist being so deep in this project and permitting probably 70 projects across Maine. But I thought it was an interesting step that you may want to consider in your municipality by pulling together citizens. What I'm finding in general is that every town is unique, and the needs of the town are different from one town to the other. So you can go to the next slide. In light of that, I think we've got to kind of take a very nuanced approach to how we're doing development. Next slide. There we go. Great. So when we're working with our clients, we're interested in permitting real projects. That may sound sort of silly and obvious, but there's a lot of speculative projects out there right now that we're finding where this flood of projects came into Maine, and a bunch of developers put in interconnection applications somewhat sporadically. And so the projects that we're working on are ones that are actually going to get steel in the ground and be built. And the goal here is really to benefit Mainers. I know a couple other people on this webinar have talked about it, but it's important to remember that these programs that we're talking about that are under 5 megawatts, they're designed to benefit Mainers. They're designed to benefit not only ratepayers, but municipalities. Andrew talked about doing a power purchase agreement with towns. All of the power developed under the projects that fall under LD 1711 that Todd talked about, all that power has to stay in Maine by law, which is really cool. And that's finally we can say that, and Maine is now like a state that's highly sought after by developers. So we've really made some great strides recently. But I think it's important to be patient. There's some articles out there right now, like in the Press Herald, talking about how there's a huge queue and what's really sort of the amount of solar projects that are proposed. With a lot of activity comes, a lot of chaos. And what we're finding is that a lot of developers are trying to remain patient as the queue gets shaken out. So you may have a bunch of projects that want to be developed in your town, but you might only see like 2 or 3 because the substation only has a certain amount of capacity. So this is what I mean about developing real projects. Just be patient with a lot of activity happening, and you'll find that you probably won't see a ton of projects happening in your town. A few towns maybe like Sanford or larger municipalities may see more because they have more load. But smaller towns in rural Maine are going to be constrained to probably 2 or 3 projects. You can go to the next slide, please. So similar to what Nick was talking about, siting guides everything for us. We go deeper in the work that we do past the sort of publicly available data, and we perform the actual site surveys. And so this is a necessary step for every project. If a project developer comes to your town and wants to do, they've got a site plan and it's made out of wetlands pulled from National Wetland Inventory, NWI, that's not good enough. So we need to have very site-specific data once we get granular down to the actual parcel, the subject parcel that we're working with. We also will review the beginning with habitats maps. And so Nick's right on, those are really great resources. They show the areas to avoid. There might be an eagle's nest nearby that you didn't know about. There might be inland wading bird and fowl habitat a few miles away that might catch the attention of Maine Fish and Wildlife. So threading the needle with project development is really important. However, there are a lot of options and ways to get around this. So again, as some advice to you as a person from the municipality, you can put some pressure, I think, on developers to say, why didn't you develop the project over here? I see that you've got it in this particular location, but that's kind of an important area for us and really for the state. So help us understand why it's so critical to put the project here. So again, siting guides everything, and it's a really important part of how we roll out this this program in Maine responsibly. Next slide. So a huge part of this, back to the fact that towns are unique and they have unique personalities and unique needs. And Greenville up on Moosehead Lake is very different than Winthrop down in sort of central Maine. So we highly promote education. And I think as a town, if you can facilitate meetings where the planning board and the select board, the code enforcement officer, and any other stakeholder within your town can be a part of the same educational process, that's really the best way for you to all get on the same page. I work in probably 70 different towns, that's 70 across Maine, and I'm happy to have anybody on this webinar reach out to me directly to ask for examples of towns that are doing this well. Everybody kind of had to figure it out at the same time on their own because the big rush of solar projects happened, and there was a lot of well, what are you doing and what are you doing, and oh, I don't know, and it was a bit chaotic. But I think you finally are now finding that there are towns that have figured this out and they feel more comfortable than they did a year ago. So if you're looking for resources on different people to call that can be helpful in your town where you haven't seen this activity, please reach out to me. I'm happy to do that. So next slide, please. So when we're talking about putting projects in a particular location, we encourage our clients to follow design best practices. So one of the things that I really like is kind of more on the nerdy kind of tech side here, like building things, is this agricultural style fence that you see in this image. So, chain link is a kind of a go-to fence, and it certainly works and it certainly passes code. But one of the considerations that we're giving is to try to fit the project as much as possible to the local vernacular. And so the agricultural style fence not only meets National Electric Code, because it's 7 or 8 feet tall, depending on the type that you buy, but it will last, the life of the project. It's able to be maintained, and it's also something that installers locally are familiar with. So just one of those little tricks that we really like. I think, again, as a tip to the municipality, ask the developers to consider this type of a fence, because it's not as, kind of maybe institutional like as a chain link fence. We also want to emphasize with our projects that planting meadow grass underneath the solar panels and within the fence, and even a little bit outside the fence, as you can see here in this picture, that is a best practice for stormwater control. So the DEP views the meadow buffer as the best way to manage stormwater. On these kind of projects, we are not proposing any sort of like detention basins, large swales. Sometimes we have some controls because of topography, like maybe there's some stone diaphragm or some sort of infiltration drain. But for the most part, when the rain hits the solar panels and drips onto the meadow, that's enough to manage the stormwater. So we don't have more stormwater leaving the site than we did previous to it. It's kind of a null issue. Also, the DEP does not regard solar panels as impervious. You may think that they are, because obviously, no water gets through them, but the way that it drips off and goes in between the solar panels and the ability for grass to grow underneath, you can see that from this picture, this is kind of a in-process picture. This is a project that I worked on like 3 or 4 years ago, and the grass hasn't fully grown in, but you can see that the grass is clearly growing underneath the solar panels. So from the DEP's perspective, a meadow buffer is a really great way to manage stormwater, and that's another thing that we propose. We don't ask them to put like gravel under these things and landscaping fabric to try to keep the weeds out. We want the grass to grow. And then lastly, we can only mow this typically no more than twice per year. So when you think about like bird habitat, nesting season, we're not talking about a lot of activity on these projects. In fact, we've worked recently on a project in Bangor, near the Penjajawak Marsh, and I'm sure Nick's very familiar with that resource. And we worked closely with the Penjajawak Marsh Commission to ensure that the timing of the mowing, the proximity to the marsh. We worked with Maine Fish and Wildlife very closely on this, and in the end, they were very excited about that. Again, feel free to reach out to Penjajawak Marsh about this, but they felt that this was the best use of this property just to the south of the marsh versus a subdivision. And oftentimes that's kind of the decision for many of these landowners. Is it a subdivision where we're going to put in a bunch of houses, or is it going to be a solar project? And a solar project is a very, very low impact construction project. It's just steel posts in the ground with a fence around it and some conduit that's underground. So I guess we're finding that there are ways to create symbiotic relationships between solar and the natural environment around it. And it's a really exciting way for Maine to kind of benefit financially while also not having an environmental impact at the same time. And then I guess lastly, last slide here, we had a ton of growth happening in this state with solar, and I don't think that it's over. I think we've maybe seen somewhat of a peak of it because the queue is pretty jammed up. But I would encourage towns to not feel that they need to over-regulate these projects. Again, every town is different, and an ordinance for one town and the language that we put in it might be different than what's needed in a different town. So a lot of collaboration between the stakeholders within your town and also with people like us on this panel is a really important step. We're still just trying to figure this out. And so, there's a great starting document of the model ordinance that Todd Martin and Nicholas Lund, so at NRCM and Maine Audubon, helped to put together. And it's a really great way for you to start on it. But call those guys up, call me up and say, hey, so could we make some changes here? Our needs in this town are a little bit unique. What do you think about this? So I'm excited about that collaborative effort that we're doing here, and that these efforts to create resources should be the beginning of the work that we're doing in Maine versus like saying, check, we've got this. We've got a lot of great people on this panel, and so I know that they're nodding their heads with me like, yeah, let's collaborate and do more together. So appreciate your time on this webinar. Thanks again, Todd and Nick, for putting this together.
Great, thanks, Chris. And I'm going to queue up Joe and Tracy. I'm going to queue up your slides here. Before we get to our final presentation, before we get to the Q&A, just want to encourage folks who are tuning in to, if you have a question for any of our panelists, please type that into the Q&A box, and we will get to questions right after we hear from the good folks in Rangeley. Just trying to pull up that presentation. Bear with me a second. All right. And let's go. Beginning. Okay. All right. Joe and Tracy, take it away.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning. I'm Joe Roach from Rangeley. I'm the town manager here. With me this morning is the assistant town manager, Tracy, and she'll be presenting to you shortly. So the picture that you have on the screen is a solar project that Rangeley is part of. It was put together by Revision Energy, and it's off-site. This is not in the town of Rangeley. This is in Skowhegan, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. Next slide, please, Todd. So again, as I mentioned, Tracy is with me, the assistant town manager. I'm going to give everybody a little municipal background and talk about why Rangeley was looking to save money on electricity. And then Tracy's going to get into a little bit more about the details of the agreement with Revision. Next slide, please. So Rangeley has approximately 1,200 year-round residents, and that population, as many of you know, swells seasonally. It can be 6,000 to 8,000 people in the region in the summertime. We're located in Western Maine in Franklin County, which is a distance away from Skowhegan. We have a remote location, and we are the service center for the region. We provide a lot of municipal services, which require municipal facilities. Next slide, please. So these facilities are the bulk of what we have. Our transfer station is on a parcel that's 126 acres. About 10 of that are developed for the actual operations of the transfer station. The remainder is forested. We'll get to that in a minute. And that transfer station is open 6.5 days a week in the summertime and 5 days a week in the wintertime. So again, it's very service oriented. If you think of a town that's got 1,200 people, to have that level of service is quite high. So we also offer street lights. Most towns do that. We have a public safety building where the fire department is stationed out of. The ambulance service works out of there. The town office has all of our functions here, the treasurer, the CO, police chief, public works, so forth. So we have a town office that's connected to the public safety building. It's a pretty big complex. Quasic Fire Station is a substation, but all of these facilities require electricity. Highway Garage has a pretty big footprint. They have welding equipment. There are 2 furnaces in that building. Town Park has a bathhouse. It's really only used in the summertime, but there is accent lighting pretty much year round. Comfort stations, I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. Comfort stations are 24/7 restrooms in Rangeley. So there's one in Rangeley downtown, there's one in Quasic. And then of course we have an airport. SRE is snow removal equipment. So there's a building that's heated in the wintertime. AWAS is the automated weather system. That doesn't take a lot of electricity, but and the runway lights don't either, but that's really an illustration of our power needs. That's what I'm trying to demonstrate here. So next slide, please. This is just a picture of the comfort station. And the note I made was that, these are open to the public 24/7. And so they have electricity. They are very efficient. They're not very old buildings, but they do require electricity. Next slide, please. This truck does not require any electricity. This is stationed at the airport, but in the background is the SRE building that I had noted before. And there's a big bucket loader in there too. It's got to be heated. And again, the electricity that we're using, I don't want to give the impression that this is, an optional thing, that we're using a lot of electricity because we don't take it seriously. We're using it because we have to have it. These things are essential functions of our local government. Next slide. So next I want to talk a little bit about some of the other land assets that Rangeley has. This is taken from the top of what's known as Chick Hill locally. It's where our wastewater treatment facility is located. And the exposed earth there is from a mining project that, and it's hard to see in this picture, but pretty much in the middle of the picture there is a runway expansion at the airport. You're looking at the airport buildings all the way on the right, and then the runway expansion on the left. That's almost 100 feet above the original elevation. So this is a 100-acre lot, approximately, not very well suited because of the slope on this end for solar installation. Next slide, please. So this is a picture that I took from a few steps back where we just were. I've turned a little bit to the south. And you can see kind of in this picture the storage lagoon and a couple of treatment lagoons for the wastewater treatment facility. This is 460 acres, and the town staff had been looking at ways to offset the electric costs of all those things I've kind of just shared with you. You know, the facilities, the services we provide. They were thinking, okay, we've got the real estate assets here. You know, should we be exploring this, and should we be looking for solar? And that's if you go to the next slide, that's what they had been working on. You know, we have several hundred acres of land. The transfer station, you know, they discovered, as I noted, is forested. It doesn't make a lot of sense, as we heard earlier, to deforest this and then put in solar panels. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So they kind of ruled that out. But they really were looking at the wastewater treatment facility because it is a large area, and the top of it was, you know, not really being used for anything. So they were exploring those possibilities, and then once they began doing that, they had some discoveries, and I'm going to turn it over to the assistant town manager, Tracy Pitt-Lavoie. At this point, she'll talk more about what happened next.
Good morning, everyone. One of the downsides of being one of the last people to speak is that some of what I'm going to share with you is a reiteration of what some of our other presenters have already talked to you about today. You can go to the next slide if you'd like to, please. So at the end of 2019, we invited 4 vendors to present to the select board various options and what they were, their business models. Two of these vendors did site visits, and through the process, we found out that we could have some problematic landscape. Some of our best locations seem to have ledge and that sort of thing. And then we also found through the process that we had a private application that had already been queued and would probably fill up our power stations. So at that point, we were looking at either, you know, having to run new phase 3 power. And it was just kind of turning into something other than what we were really wanting to tie into. Next slide, please. So at that time, Revision brought us an opportunity for an offsite collaborative facility. This would utilize net metering for the monetary solar credits to put toward our CMP bills. What we found attractive about this is that, so it being investor financed, there's no upfront or out-of-pocket expense to us. The investors would pay for the land lease, operations, maintenance, property liability insurance, and they would be responsible for the removal of an array at the end of the project. And that was something for me that was really kind of, it was hitching with me that we've recently, you know, come across some, we've still got lines on our power poles downtown from a cable company that they just abandoned the region, and they left the satellites at the airport. And so that just kept kind of ringing with me. I was rather concerned that, you know, 20, 30 years from now, if we would be facing some of these same problems. But with an offsite option, it took all of those worries right away. So next project, please, or next slide, please. So to get this to all come together, we submitted a year's worth of CMP bills to Revision, and they calculated how many kilowatts they estimated that we would use in a year. And it came out to be about 700 kilowatts, or about $106,000, right in that neighborhood. The way that the PPA proposal for an offsite works is they aim to offset 85% of your usage, leaving a 15% buffer, so you don't have the the risk of unusing some of your solar credits and forfeiting them. So it's just a more efficient, it's a more efficient goal to use 85% rather than to try and get 100% of it covered, because there is that wiggle room in there. And then right on the heels of that, we got the opportunity to switch to LED streetlights, which would offer us another $7,000 a year saving. So that would put us for the year 2021, we're looking at saving $97,150 against our electricities. And this was with no out-of-pocket costs to the taxpayers of Rangeley. So I think that's very exciting. That's just 1 year's worth of savings. So I'll turn it back over to Joe for the wrap up, and thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Very nice. So this is the last slide. And Tracy hit the high points. She really told you the bread and butter of this whole process. But Tracy and I went to the ribbon cutting ceremony in Skowhegan, and I don't know this gentleman's name. I believe he was the project superintendent, and he was explaining. Yeah, did a great job, and it was a great presentation. At the day we went, this equipment was not online. We've received a letter in the last couple of days that it is now, I believe. I think it is on December 30th. But what I took away from this being on site was that it's very low maintenance. It's quiet. Obviously, doesn't really make any noise. And it's low profile. And low profile, I compare it to wind power and so forth. I mean, it's very low profile. And it's, again, I believe it's online as of December 30th. So we'll be experiencing the benefits of this project in this fiscal year, I believe. So all in all, pretty good project, good people to work with, and that's what we have to share with you today.
Great, thanks very much, Joe and Tracy, for your good work in Rangeley and for joining us here this morning. So folks, we have about a half an hour for questions and answer from the audience. I see about 5 questions in the question box. Again, if you have a question for any of our panelists, or a question about an issue that maybe didn't come up this morning, please type that question into the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many questions as we can here in the next 30 minutes or so. So Chris, I'm going to start with a question for you, coming from a friend of mine, Scott Vlan in Norway. The question is, given how slow Central Maine Power has been to permit projects and increase capacity, will transitioning to the possibility of kind of transitioning to a consumer-owned utility, would that speed up the speed at which kind of these solar projects are coming online?
It's a good question. I don't think that that's the problem. I don't think that sort of the large nature of CMP is the challenge here. The problem is the amount of interconnection applications that they received in a very short period of time. And also our grid infrastructure has created a queue. So some substations can only handle 2 projects, but they may have 7 on there. The ownership model of CMP wouldn't really change that all that much. I have actually found CMP to be pretty responsive in this period of development. They've brought on outside contractors to process their pre-application reports, which is a very quick, like, tell me if there's capacity in this line, as well as their interconnection applications. I've met field staff out on projects to talk about where poles should go, where's the best place for them. They are awesome to work with. So for the most part, I've been pretty happy with how CMP has been handling this. I'm not sure if an ownership model change would really improve that all that much.
Great, thanks, Chris. Andrew, I'm going to pitch this next question over to you, coming from a question from Jan. Question is, what type of energy savings could a community expect to realize from such a solar project? So, we just heard from Rangeley that they're going to save a significant amount of money on their electricity bills. Maybe do you have a ballpark, an average of, what most towns are saving by switching to solar?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it heavily depends on when municipalities move forward, whether they're doing on-site or off-site, what the options are. I would say that on the low end, some communities are saving 5 to 10% on their power bills, and on the higher end, maybe 20 to 25%. But it's all heavily dependent on on-site versus off-site, how much load you're bringing to the table, and a number of other factors.
Absolutely. Yeah, it depends on the town, depends on how much energy they're using and, what size of a project. So, so Chris, there's another question here for you. This question coming in from Nathaniel. You mentioned that many towns have started permitting projects already. Could you share an example of a town maybe that went through the permitting process, smoothly, and a town that did particularly well permitting and maybe citing a solar project?
Sure. I think Bangor did a good job with this. We did a 4 or 5 megawatt project. It was between 20 and 30 acres. And they primarily worked with their existing land use code. So while it maybe didn't have a lot of very specific things for solar, it still required the applicant to provide technical capability, stormwater controls. These are all things that would be typical on any kind of a development. And so I think what it also came down to is they had Ann Krieg is their town planner there. She was awesome to work with. And so just having a dedicated person that, takes the time to kind of work with the developer, to work with us as the consultants, to give us advice behind the scenes, like, hey guys, maybe just could you provide me with this thing? It would be really helpful. She was just a great advocate. And so Bangor seemed to have like the right recipe of mentality for doing this well. And we were able to, it wasn't over in like one meeting, it still took us many months to get through it. But I think their thoughtfulness and approach to this with their existing land use ordinance made this for I think they're very happy with it. They're really excited about the project. So that's a big municipality, but then like kind of on the smaller side, I think maybe like the town of Rockport, they took a similar approach. They were really early in the stage when we started working with them at like 2019. And they just asked us to be patient with them and to walk the site with the planning board. Actually, we did like a virtual streamed planning board. So it was like really early COVID stuff. So we tried to stream Zoom on our phone, on our iPhone while we were walking around. It did not work. Don't do that. So we abandoned that and then made a video and then showed it to them later. But they were concerned about aesthetics, especially being in Rockport. It's a very like picturesque town. But to them, it was about involvement and engagement, and their planning board was asking us for things that were very reasonable, that any project would probably be able to comply with. And again, I think they feel pretty happy with the end result. It's a project near Mace's Pond on Rockport. So anyway, kind of the theme of that is just sort of taking a really practical approach and not being afraid to ask questions of the developer.
Great, thanks. Andrew, I'm not sure if you can answer this next question, or maybe Joe or Tracy can answer this question, but the question comes from Larry, who asks, what made the Skowhegan land attractive for solar development? Andrew, do you know much about that parcel where the solar project was developed in Skowhegan that Rangeley is tapping into?
Yeah, I can speak broadly to it. Though I was not involved in the development of the parcel, I can say that it was a parcel that didn't require any tree clearing. It was quite flat, virtually no contours. The soil there was deep enough so that we were able to drive piles to a depth of 8 feet, which really reduces the cost compared to having to set ground screws if there's bedrock. Or if it's, subsurface boulders, and proximity to 3-phase power. And then something that I mentioned, I think in like 4 out of my slides, which is that the grid capacity was there, which is always the alpha and omega of these projects. What are the hurdles to getting the project interconnected, and whether there's the capacity on the local substation to accept the project. And so that turned out to be a low hurdle on this site. And then the last thing is that the investor who financed the project also owns this parcel of land. So that's sort of reducing the number of players in the deal structure, also really improves the financials for a lot of these projects.
Great. Let's see. Chris or Andrew, this might be a question for either of you. How long does the typical solar project take to go from concept to fully operational solar projects? You know, we're talking 6 months, 6 years. You know, what's kind of the average from kind of concept to fully operational project?
I don't know about you, Andrew. I'd say at least a year. Sometimes it can take a year just to get through the permitting before, and then you get your permit in December, but you can't start until April or May. So, you know, it's an 18-month process is kind of what people should wrap their head around. You agree?
I would agree. You know, I think Dirt Capital is a great, I should say the Skowhegan project is a great example of a project that was very low friction on many parts of development. You know, sorry to keep harping on this, but especially with interconnection, they got the first queue position on that substation. And they actually got their interconnection process completed before CMP started doing cluster studies in that area, where essentially they're taking a number of local projects and sort of grouping them together to do sort of regional engineering studies, which is very time consuming. So I would say a project like Dirt Capital was able to sort of slide in on a pretty quick basis, but this interconnection issue is creating additional delays because there's not much left in terms of first queue position on the substations around the state right now. There's only a handful that still have QP1 available, which means, yeah, 18 months I think is about the minimum that you're talking about for development and construction. However, that said, smaller on-site projects, 100, 200 kilowatt rooftop projects, in some cases still have an opportunity to move forward in a 6-month time frame. You know, again, provided the substation capacity is available.
Great. Nick, I'm going to pitch this next question over to you. Another question from Scott Vaughn over in Norway. Has to do with land use around solar developments. The question is anyone in Maine working on integrating food production near solar arrays? You know, Chris talked a little bit about, and you talked a little bit about, Nick, you know, planting native vegetation and creating habitat for pollinators. But Scott is sort of wondering if anybody's working on you know, agricultural production around solar panels. So.
Yeah, you know, integrating solar with the agriculture is a hot topic. You know, there are a lot of farmers out there who are interested in this other source of income and using their land to harvest the sun, basically. And lots of folks are looking into how those things can work together. So a farm could use, you know, put solar panels on a certain piece of its land, continue to farm on the rest of the land and work like that. Those projects are happening all around the state, and Chris and others may know more details. I know that Maine Audubon is working with a engineering firm called Sebago Technics here in Maine to develop vegetation management best practices and documents that we're going to release hopefully in the spring, which can be used more on the natural vegetation side or vegetation management side to really take advantage of the new landscapes created by solar fields.
I would add to that, you know, one of the reasons a meadow buffer is most common, like a fescue dominant field, is because that is your stormwater control. And so that's the part of it that's infiltrating the rain into the earth. And one of the challenges that I would see with kind of proliferating this, it's certainly an interesting idea. And I think there's probably some smaller projects that are testing this out to see what it's like. But the challenge will be satisfying your stormwater needs with the DEP. So with the meadow buffer, you can't mow it more than twice a year. If you do, the grass is too short and therefore won't infiltrate the water. So, you know, I know Jim Byers would have a question about this. If we did like, I think the question was leafy greens and, you know, something that would probably probably not manage the stormwater as well. It's certainly productive area, but you don't have the same amount of ability to put that water into the ground. So it's a consideration that we need to keep in mind. If we want to have something else going under the panels, it may create more stormwater challenges outside of the project that would, sort of have unintended consequences. So it's definitely case by case. It's cool to see it certain areas, but probably not something that should be applied broadly across all projects.
Great. So Nick, maybe this next question, or excuse me, Andrew, maybe this next question is for you regarding decommissioning and recycling of solar panels and mounts after the end of their useful life. I've personally got a lot of questions from NRCM members in recent months about who's responsible for solar energy equipment after the end of its useful life in 20, 25, 30 years, and how do you recycle materials from solar arrays? So can you speak a little bit to both of those questions?
Yeah, I would say that the vast majority of solar projects are on leased land, and it is the responsibility of the investor, the owner of that equipment, to return that land to its previous state upon the completion of the solar project. Again, we're looking 40, 50 years out. The vast majority of the material equipment that is involved in a solar project is copper, aluminum, steel, and glass. So highly recyclable. Buried wires, racking, rail, things like that. So it's all highly recyclable. There's a lot of focus on the actual silicon crystals, the doped silicon crystals, which contain those rare earth minerals. And we do see, essentially the recycling industry develops as product. It reaches the end of its useful life and needs to be retired. And then sort of the techniques and the scale of that recycling industry rises to meet it. We are aware that there are techniques for recycling and removing those rare earth minerals from the surface of the silicon crystals, and that industry essentially is starved for material because the dawn of the photovoltaic industry is really in the 1970s, and so we're really only retiring solar panels that were installed in the 70s and 80s, which is a diminishingly small quantity compared to what we're installing today. And so, it may certainly look like these solar panels just go to the dump because that actually is in some cases what's happening, though I would say many of what's being decommissioned today still has a useful second life on somebody's camp or something like that. And I think that that's probably what we'll see is the second market for something that's no longer investment grade, but that people will be happy to use on their RVs and at their camps and boats. But yeah, certainly deconstructing this equipment is future technology that we will see rise to the scale of the problem.
Great. So there's just one more question in the Q&A box. Again, if folks have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. We're also happy to give you time in your afternoon back. We certainly don't have to go until 12:30, but one more question as of now in the Q&A box from Ted Walworth. And maybe Chris or Andrew, you could answer this one. Could or should solar panels be placed at existing wind turbine facilities, given the fact that those sites already have power lines and road access? Is it possible to build solar arrays at existing wind power facilities in Maine and beyond? Is that feasible?
Yeah, I think it's an idea. Many wind developers, as we know, we've got a ton of wind energy production in Maine, more than many people would think. And so a lot of those developers that built this infrastructure are kind of turning to solar. So they're like, we did wind, now we can do solar. And I think that the answer is like, it depends. So a lot of times these wind turbines have wind projects have long transmission lines, and they're privately owned, and they're typically at a voltage higher than we may want to interconnect to for a DG project, a distributed generation project. However, they also have in many cases, built their own substations. And so those substations may have a bus to be able to interconnect at a voltage that would be suitable to a solar project. And so if there's capacity on that privately owned substation, which already is kind of interconnected to the grid, then that works. As you know, as Ted indicated, yeah, probably not a good idea to do it on big rooftops, but once that transmission comes off the, sorry, not rooftops, ridge lines, sorry. I'm organized. So big ridge line is not a great place for solar panels, but once the power comes off the ridge line and it is now in the flatter land and the miles down the road, down the way, maybe. I'm not commonly seeing it. I think a lot of projects are more commonly sited next to Route 1 or big roads where we've got existing distributed generation power lines and we're working with a landowner. So it's not a bad idea, just not something I'm commonly seeing. You agree, Andrew? You kind of, am I hitting that right, you think?
I 100% agree with you, Chris. I think that the opportunity there is probably mostly for wholesale transmission level sales of solar power rather than distributed generation and net metering credits. And second, you know, I'll repeat the thing that Chris said, which is probably the land characteristics of ideal solar development and ideal wind development are not very compatible. I've only been out to one solar farm that was interested in considering it, and they just looked at the contour profile of what they owned, and it was, you know, there was just no place to put solar in a way that was inexpensive at scale. So yeah, so it's a really great idea. I think in practice, it's probably, you probably maybe see one or two of these, but not common.
Yeah. Great. Well, there's no other questions in the chat box, so we're gonna give you 10 minutes to get an early lunch. Really appreciate all of you joining us here today. Many thanks to all of our panelists, especially to Joe and Tracy for joining us in Rangeley as well. We really appreciate the good work that you've done in Rangeley and serving as a model for other towns in your part of Maine.